Let your mind drift away from the singular figures of kings and queens, with their dramatic battles and personal feuds. To truly understand the slow, quiet erosion of the Merovingian dynasty, you must look not at the person on the throne, but at the office that grew in the shadow beside it. You must imagine yourself not on a battlefield, but within the walls of a Merovingian royal villa. Picture a sprawling, chaotic, and largely self-sufficient agricultural estate. The court is not a gleaming, centralized capital, but the king's extended household, the Palatium, a traveling entourage of family, servants, bodyguards, and administrators. And at the very heart of this world, where the line between the personal and the political was hopelessly blurred, stood an official whose title began as a humble boast, the major domus, the greatest of the house. The story of the mayor of the palace is the story of how a domestic servant became the master of the kingdom. It is a quiet, administrative history, a lesson in how real power often accumulates, not through grand pronouncements, but through the tedious, day-to-day control of resources. In its earliest form, the mayor's job was exactly what its title implied. He was the chief steward, the manager of the king's household. His responsibilities were practical and mundane. He oversaw the vast royal estates, which were the primary source of the king's wealth. He ensured the fields were plowed, the crops were harvested, and the revenues paid not in cash, but in grain, wine, cattle, and textiles were collected and stored. He was in charge of all the other palace servants. He supervised the treasurer, Thesaurarius, who guarded the king's small hoard of gold and precious objects. He directed the marshal cum stabuli, or constable, who was responsible for the king's horses. He commanded the seneschal, who oversaw the food and drink for the royal table. When the king and his itinerant court traveled from one villa to another, as they constantly did to consume the resources of their various estates, it was the mayor who organized the supplies, managed the logistics, and ensured the entire sprawling enterprise did not collapse into chaos. He was, in essence, a highly effective and powerful chief of staff. But his authority was, at first, entirely domestic and derived solely from his personal proximity to the king. However, in the Merovingian world, there was no meaningful distinction between the king's private household and the public state. The kingdom was the king's estate. Therefore, the man who controlled the household inevitably began to control the kingdom. The seeds of immense political power were embedded in the mayor's seemingly domestic duties. The most important of these was his control of the purse. By managing the king's wealth, the mayor controlled the flow of patronage. In a society built on personal loyalty, kings maintained the support of their powerful nobles by giving them gifts, sacks of gold, fine weapons, and, most importantly, grants of land. The mayor of the palace was the gatekeeper of this system. He advised the king on who should receive favor and who should not. A noble seeking a royal grant quickly learned that the path to the king's ear led directly through the mayor's antechamber. This made the mayor the central node in the kingdom's vast network of power and obligation. Furthermore, the mayor's authority extended to the king's personal retinue, the lutes, who were the sworn bodyguards and elite warriors of the court. As the official responsible for provisioning, equipping, and paying these men, their practical day-to-day loyalty began to gravitate toward him. He was the one who ensured their bellies were full and their purses were heavy. The king was a distant, sacred figure. The mayor was the man who signed the requisitions. This gave him immense military influence within the heart of the court itself. The power of the office was magnified during the frequent periods of a royal minority. The violent, turbulent nature of the Merovingian world meant that kings often died young, leaving child princes on the throne. During these long regencies, the queen mother would have to rely on a powerful and trustworthy mayor to manage the kingdom and protect her son from his rapacious uncles and rival nobles. We saw how both Brunhilde and Fredegonde relied on mayors to execute their political will. These periods set a powerful precedent. It became normal for the mayor to wield the full authority of the king, governing the realm in his name. For the first century and a half of Merovingian rule, this system, while giving the mayors immense influence, remained in balance. The mayor was still, in theory, the king's appointee. A strong king could dismiss a mayor who grew too powerful. But the great turning point, the event that shattered this balance forever, was the Edict of Paris in 614. As you will recall, King Clothar II had been forced to issue this decree to reward the nobles who had betrayed Queen Brunhilda and handed him the unified kingdom. This edict was a revolution disguised as a legal document. It contained a clause that effectively stripped the king of his right to appoint his own mayor. From now on, the mayor would be chosen from among the ranks of the great landowning nobles of each respective kingdom, Neustria, Austrasia, and Burgundy. This single change transformed the office completely. The mayor was no longer the king's man. He was now the nobility's man, placed in the palace to represent their interests and to control the king on their behalf. His power base was no longer the fickle favor of the monarch, but the deep-rooted, land-based power of the aristocracy. The office of mayor became the ultimate political prize, and the powerful families of the realm began a relentless struggle to dominate it. This new reality solidified the deep-seated rivalry between the major sub-kingdoms of the Frankish realm. The political history of the 7th century is essentially the story of the struggle between the mayors of Neustria and Austrasia. Neustria, the western kingdom encompassing Paris and Soissons, was more heavily Romanized. Its aristocracy was more established and court-based, favoring a more centralized form of government, so long as they were the ones at the center. Austrasia, the eastern kingdom along the Rhine, was more Germanic, more rural, and dominated by a fiercely independent, militaristic aristocracy, whose power came from their vast, semi-autonomous estates. It was in Austrasia that the one family destined to win this struggle began its patient rise. The Pippinids, the clan formed by the marriage of the families of Pepin, of Landen, and Bishop Arnulf, of Metz, came to embody the Austrasian spirit. Their enormous landholdings in the Meuse and Moselle river valleys gave them a power base that was almost entirely independent of any king. They could raise their own armies from their own lands. They were not just politicians at court. They were regional princes in their own right. And so, the stage was set for a final confrontation. The office of mayor had completed its long, slow evolution from a domestic servant to a political kingmaker. It was now the hereditary possession of the most powerful aristocratic factions. The Merovingian king was becoming a spectator in his own palace. The next phase of the struggle would not be about who could best advise the king, but about which faction could eliminate its rivals and seize control of the mayorship of the entire Frankish world. In the coming clash between the mayors of Neustria and Austrasia, which model of power would ultimately prove superior? Would it be the court-based, political power of the Neustrian mayors, or would it be the land-based, military might of the Austrasian Pippinids? The answer to that question would be decided on a battlefield called Tertry, and it would seal the fate of the Merovingian dynasty. The decades following the failed coup of Grimoald the Elder were defined by a tense and simmering rivalry. The Frankish world was a bipolar entity, dominated by the political gravity of its two most powerful mayors. In Neustria, the court at Paris or Soissons was the center of power, and the mayorship was held by a succession of ambitious men who sought to dominate the entire realm. The most formidable of these was Ebroin, who held the office for much of the latter half of the 7th century. Ebroin was, in many ways, the last great champion of a centralized Frankish state under Neustrian leadership. He was a man of immense energy, political skill, and utter ruthlessness, a true successor to the spirit of Fredegund. His goal was to crush the independent-minded aristocracies of Austrasia and Burgundy and force them to submit to his authority, reunifying the kingdom under his own iron-fisted mayorship. For a time, he was remarkably successful. He outmaneuvered his rivals, controlled his Merovingian kings like puppets, and extended his influence over the other kingdoms. He was so powerful that he even played a role in the tragic story of Dagobert II, when the Austrasian nobles, seeking a legitimate Merovingian to counter Ebroin's influence, recalled the long-exiled Dagobert from his monastery in Ireland and placed him on their throne. Ebroin saw it as a threat. A few years later, Dagobert II was murdered while on a hunting trip, an assassination that many historians believe was orchestrated by Ebroin to remove a king who was proving too independent. Ebroin demonstrated that the mayor of the palace now held the power of life and death over the sacred kings themselves. But his tyranny and relentless ambition earned him a host of enemies. In 680, like so many powerful figures of his era, he was cut down by an assassin's blade, creating a power vacuum in Neustria that the patient Austrasians were finally ready to exploit. While Ebroin had been dominating Neustria, the Pipinid family had been quietly rebuilding their strength in Austrasia. In 680, like so many powerful figures of his era, he was cut down by an assassin's blade, creating a power vacuum in Neustria that the patient Austrasians were finally ready to exploit. While Ebroin had been dominating Neustria, the Pipinid family had been quietly rebuilding their strength in Austrasia. After the disaster of Grimhold's execution, they had learned their lesson. The new leader of the clan was Pepin of Herstal, also known as Pepin II. He was the embodiment of Austrasian power. His authority did not come from a position at a royal court, but from the bedrock of his family's immense, semi-private land holdings in the Meuse and Rhine valleys. He could raise powerful armies from his own vassals, men loyal not to a distant Merovingian king, but to him personally, the lord who granted them land and led them in battle. Pepin became the chosen champion of the fiercely independent Austrasian nobles, who chafed under the centralizing ambitions of Ebroin and his Neustrian successors. With Ebroin dead and Neustria in disarray, Pepin saw his moment. The simmering rivalry between the two mayorships finally boiled over into open war. The final showdown came in 687, at the Battle of Tertry in modern-day northern France. You must understand that this was not a war between kings. The nominal Merovingian king of Neustria, Wuderick III, was present, but he was This was a battle for the soul of the Frankish political system. It was a clash between two institutional models, the centralized, court-based mayorship of Neustria versus the land-based aristocratic mayorship of Austrasia. It was a battle to decide who would be the master of the king, and therefore, the master of the kingdom. Pepin of Herstal's Austrasian forces, hardened by years of frontier warfare, won a crushing and absolute victory. The Neustrian army was shattered, and Pepin captured both the Neustrian mayor and his king, Wuderick III. At this moment, Pepin held the entire Frankish world in his hands. He could have deposed King Wuderick. He could have tried to place himself on the throne, as his ancestor Grimold had done. But the memory of his family's failed coup was long. Pepin was far too shrewd to make the same mistake. He had no desire to be a dead usurper. He wanted to be a living ruler. His solution was a stroke of political genius that would define the next stage of Merovingian history. He kept King Wuderick III on the throne. He propped up the fiction of Merovingian rule. But he had himself declared the mayor of the palace not just for his native Austrasia, but for Neustria and Burgundy as well. He consolidated the office of the mayor into a single, supreme position. From this point on, there would be one powerless king of the Franks, and one all-powerful mayor of the palace for all the Franks. He had achieved total control without touching the crown. To signify this new reality, Pepin adopted the title, Dux et Princeps Francorum, Duke and Prince of the Franks. The title was a carefully crafted piece of political branding. Dux signified his role as the supreme military commander, the leader of the armies. Princeps was an old Roman title, meaning first citizen or first man of the state, a title that implied leadership without the royal baggage. The title perfectly encapsulated his new role. He was the practical, secular ruler of the Frankish people, while the sacred, magical legitimacy remained with the long-haired king in the palace. Under Pepin's nearly 30-year rule, The separation between the reality of power and the symbolism of kingship became absolute. The mayorship was now effectively a hereditary position for the Pepinid family. Pepin was the patriarch of a new shadow dynasty that ran the kingdom from behind the curtain. The Merovingian kings became a succession of short-lived, interchangeable phantoms. When one died, Pepin would simply reach into a monastery, find another descendant of Clovis, and install him on the throne. The king's only job was to exist, to provide the unbroken line of sacred blood that the Frankish world still seemed to require. The actual business of the kingdom, war, law, diplomacy, administration, was now entirely in the hands of the mayor of the palace and his loyal retainers. Pepin of Herstal had perfected the system. He had solved the political puzzle that had vexed his ancestors. He had found a way to wield absolute, monarchical power without the risks that came with the royal title. The mayor of the palace was now an unofficial, hereditary king, and the Merovingian monarch was a living relic, maintained for his symbolic value, like a crown jewel that was kept in a box but never worn. This strange, stable, and deeply imbalanced system seemed to work. But it was a system built entirely on the personal strength and political skill of the man who held the mayorship. What would happen when the formidable Pepin of Herstal died? Could an office built on raw power and military victory be passed on as smoothly as a crown built on generations of sacred legitimacy? And could the son, who would eventually inherit this power, a son born of a mistress and forced to fight his way out of prison, be content to rule from the shadows like his father? Or would the allure of the symbol, the crown itself, finally prove too strong to resist? The political system that Pepin of Herstal had perfected, a powerful, hereditary mayorship ruling from behind the shield of a symbolic Merovingian king, was about to face its ultimate test, its own succession. When Pepin died in 714, the crisis that followed was a near-perfect echo of the old Merovingian civil wars. His widow, Plectrude, attempted to rule as regent for her young grandson, and to secure her power, she imprisoned Pepin's strong and popular illegitimate son, Charles. The Neustrian aristocracy, sensing weakness, immediately rebelled, trying to shake off the decades of Austrasian dominance. For a few chaotic years, it seemed as if Pepin's life's work might unravel. But the man Plectrude had imprisoned was not easily contained. Charles escaped his prison and proved himself to be a military commander of singular brilliance and ruthlessness. In a series of swift campaigns, he crushed the Neustrian rebellion and defeated the forces of his own stepmother, forcibly uniting the mayorship once again under his sole command. This was Charles Martel, the Hammer. He did not just inherit the office of mayor, he reforged it in the fires of civil war. Under his leadership, the power of the mayorship reached its absolute zenith, and the pretense of royal authority became almost transparently thin. He perfected his father's military innovations, using lands confiscated from the church to create a loyal, professional army of vassals. The mayor of the palace now had a private army that far surpassed any force a king could have dreamed of mustering. His famous victory over the Umayyad army at the Battle of Tours in 732 was a triumph for the mayor, not the king. It earned him the title of Savior of Christendom, granting his family a level of prestige and a claim to divine favor that began to eclipse the ancient magical aura of the Merovingians. The most telling demonstration of his power came in 737, when his puppet king Deuteric IV died. Charles did not bother to appoint a successor. For the last 4 years of his life, he ruled the Frankish kingdom with an empty throne. When Charles Martel died in 741, he, like a king, divided his power, the mayorship, between his 2 sons, Pepin the Short and Carloman. And, for one last time, it seemed the Frankish world might fracture. But after a few years of successful joint rule, the deeply pious Carloman abdicated his immense power to retire to a monastery. This act of personal faith had a profound political consequence. It left Pepin the Short as the sole, undisputed mayor of all the Franks. Pepin now stood at the pinnacle of power. He possessed every function of a king. He commanded the armies. He administered justice. He conducted foreign policy. The actual Merovingian king, a man named Childeric III, whom Pepin and Carloman had pulled from a monastery to fill the vacant throne, was a complete nonentity. The political situation had become an absurdity. The most powerful ruler in Europe was, in title, the servant of a phantom king. Pepin, a man of immense ambition and practicality, decided it was time to align the title with the reality. He would end the charade. But he was keenly aware of the ghost of his ancestor, Grimoald the Elder, who had been executed for his clumsy attempt to usurp the throne a century earlier. Pepin knew he could not simply take the crown by force. Such an act would lack legitimacy and could provoke a rebellion. He needed to have the crown given to him by an authority that was perceived as being higher than the ancient, hereditary rights of the Merovingian bloodline. He needed the sanction of God, and the Pope in Rome was God's vicar on earth. In the year 751, Pepin the Short dispatched a formal embassy to Pope Zachary in Rome. The question they carried was a masterpiece of political framing. They did not ask, "Can we overthrow our king?" Instead, they asked a subtle, leading question of principle. Is it right that a king with no royal power should continue to hold the title of king? It was a query about the proper order of the world. The Pope, who was in desperate need of a strong military ally to protect him from the encroaching Lombards in Italy, saw the immense opportunity Pepin was offering. The Pope's answer was pragmatic and revolutionary. He replied that it seemed better for the one who held the reality of power to also be called king. This was the sacred permission Pepin needed. Armed with the Pope's blessing, he convened a great assembly of all the Frankish nobles and bishops at the royal city of Soissons. This was not a backroom conspiracy. It was a public and formal act of state transformation. The last Merovingian king, Childeric III, was brought before the assembly. There, he was formally deposed. The method was the ancient one, full of symbolic weight. His long, flowing hair, the last tangible vestige of his dynasty's sacred and magical right to rule, was shorn from his head. Tonsured and stripped of his royalty, Childeric III was sent back to a monastery, where he would live out his days and die in obscurity. There was no execution, no violence. The end of the Merovingian dynasty, which had ruled for nearly 300 years, came not with a bang, but with the quiet snip of scissors. In that same assembly, the office of mayor of the palace was formally extinguished, because its holder was about to become something more. The Frankish nobles acclaimed Pepin the Short as their new king, raising him on a shield in the traditional Germanic custom. But a new and vital ceremony was added, one that would change the nature of European kingship forever. Pepin was anointed with holy oil by Saint Boniface, the great missionary and the Pope's representative in Gaul. This anointing, modeled on the consecration of the kings of ancient Israel, signified that Pepin was not just a king by the acclamation of his people, he was king by the grace of God. The long, slow journey of the mayor of the palace was finally complete. The office, born centuries earlier as a humble domestic stewardship, had at last consumed its master. It had grown almost imperceptibly, generation by generation, accumulating duties, responsibilities, wealth, and military might. It had evolved to fill the power vacuum left by the fading Merovingian kings, until it became the true government of the Franks. The final deposition of Childeric III was not a sudden revolution. It was merely the formal acknowledgement of a political reality that had been in place for nearly a century. The mayorship had served its purpose. It had been the vessel, the chrysalis, within which a new and more vigorous dynasty, the Carolingians, had grown to maturity. Now, with the hollow shell of the old dynasty finally cast aside, the office of the mayor was dissolved, for it was no longer needed. The man who held it now wore a crown,